The broad idea of this is to look at web content analysis with a particular application of the area that I work in, which is sort of campaigns, political campaigns. But as I was saying to Tirani, actually, when you look at these methods, they've been used in a variety of political settings and political institutions. So e-government is an area where a lot of times people are trying to come up with content analysis coding schemes. Also social movements as well, like trying to study things like Amnesty, Greenpeace, charities, advocacy groups use of the web. So what's happened, I think, is that as more and more organisations have taken to the web, different kinds of approaches have been developed to try and understand and look at what that content is about, or kind of interpreting it. So this is just a very brief kind of this is locating, if you like, the approach that I use in the wider system of what you can use, to say that it's not everything, and there are other methods out there, some of which some of you may have used. But there's a basic divide in web methods between what are called digitised methods and digital methods. And the digitised methods are those that, if you like, have a kind of pre-internet life, right? So they were around before the internet, and they've been grafted on or adapted or converted to the online environment. And then there are those which seem to have no precursor, right? They're actually sort of new methods that we can't really say have a kind of a parallel in the offline environment. So what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of largely in this digitized methods example, although it's a sort of hybrid, it's a kind of mix. But studying, if you like, online campaigns, and as I said, you could substitute online government, online social movements, tends to use a number of different techniques. As I said, some of them have been adapted from the previous kind of methodologies. So interviews, for example, can be conducted online via Skype. You can do surveys. Elite campaign managers can use web surveys. There's also people have done kind of ethnographic sort of discourse, more qualitative analysis of web sites, kind of texts, and I'll describe a little bit about that because I'm just an example. And then there's this kind of online, what you might call content or feature analysis. And some of these approaches are just simply using existing kinds of content analysis approaches that are used in analysis of media texts anyway. So things like newspaper or television broadcasts that would sort of break down with coding frames, mentions of particular words, or if you're looking at television broadcasts that use semiotics or kind of visual techniques to kind of sort of basically take from the web particular kinds of media text and break them down as they would do other kinds of text. Then there's this kind of web specific, which I'm not quite sure if that's the right term for it, but this is sort of where perhaps, this is the idea of taking a whole site and actually trying to understand what the whole site is about rather than text on it or images on it. And this is sort of where perhaps, as I said, it crosses over a little bit into this digital methods idea, because it is actually introducing new types of content and design and features that have not really been approached or studied in terms of traditional content analysis. So this is kind of, if you like, where my work and what I'm going to talk about today is largely located. Then in addition, and I won't get into this, but if some of you have signed up for some of the web methods courses that are going to be taught next week, and there's a web methods workshop, there's these digital methods, and these are really kind of tools that have been developed to capture and analyse social media, particularly data. So things like blogs, blog posts, Twitter, Facebook, content, YouTube videos, and these are all different kinds of tools that you can find online. So most of them are actually free, or you just need a little bit of computer. At this point, it's not the easiest thing. There's not an off-the-shelf kind of version that we would probably teach necessarily in a class. They're all sort of competing methodologies that have been developed by different kind of people who are largely computer scientists with an interest in social science, who've gone out and said, okay, well, for example, 140kid allows you to capture tweets. It will do it for you. It will store them for you, and you can then download them and do what you want with them. So there are different methods of capturing, and some go a bit further and actually allow you to analyse, content analyse the information. But the difference, I suppose, is this is actually quite small n, generally speaking, and focuses in on particular sites. Whereas this is, you're dealing with, as I was saying to Tony, the kind of deluge of data that social media give you, trying to find a way of actually capturing it and then making sense of it. So that's for next week. That's not really what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of, I won't go into the demand side. So in terms of, as I said, one of the things, just to give you a little bit of background about some of perhaps the distinctiveness between the online content analysis or feature analysis and online discourse analysis or ethnography. So in this approach, this is sort of the idea where you look at the web content as some kind of sociocultural text. And you very much from a qualitative perspective. And what's the driving thing is to understand what does this site mean, its significance in a kind of deeper sense than going on the surface about what is actually presented or what kind of items or features are there. And there's some examples I've got up here, and particularly in the campaign contents, these two particular studies probably exemplify the method most of all. This one, the Warnick piece, is kind of nice because what she did was essentially look and say, okay, let's have a look at the different sites that were put online in the 96 campaign. And didn't do any kind of, if you like, systematic empirical analysis, but talked about them as the fact that, that what they were doing was not being very, they were pretending to be communicative and interactive, but they actually weren't. And underlying, there was use of political parody, which actually was antithetical or kind of didn't help to mobilize people, because it made people quite cynical. So the use of humour, it was quite sort of satirical sites online, didn't sort of help in the process, because it actually kind of fed this impression that politicians are a bit corrupt and a bit stupid and a bit incompetent. But she didn't go in, as I said, to do any kind of in-depth kind of comparative analysis of sites. It was more just an overall interpretation of kind of the web sphere at that time. So, as I said, the method that I'm sort of focusing on is different in the sense that it's really, you know, it looks at the website or the web page as the unit of analysis. And it's using a systematic set of criteria that are based on items or features of the web pages that are then developed into a coding scheme that's applied to sites to provide sort of quantitative measures of their content, their functionality, usability and design. And it's not just done for, you know, giggles, right? It's not just because it's like, oh, well, it's out there, let's do it. The reason behind this kind of work and why it's being done is because, A, I think it's about whether or not there's a different kind of style of political institutions and political organisations interacting with voters and citizens. So one of the key questions is, you know, is it changing the nature of campaigning? Is it changing the nature of governing? In terms of making these entities more participatory. So there's an underlying sense about the research question that's driving it is, what does it mean more broadly for the political system and citizens? And secondly, there's a kind of element that it's also used to sort of say, well, actually, what's it doing to, particularly in the party context, the balance of power between the parties. So there's this big question about, is it actually giving smaller parties and smaller players and more marginal players more of a role? And the point being that, well, how do we answer those questions? We need some way of going into the web and saying, well, what are they doing with their sites? And so this is, as I said, from the supply side, this is just looking at, okay, let's go in and sort of assess them and see, are smaller parties offering good sites? Are they keeping up with the larger parties, or are the larger parties exceeding and just reinforcing their dominance that they have offline? So the data collection side of it, I mean, this is a bit of a promo in the sense that Archive is a service that we've used. So the first thing that challenge that you face is actually getting an archive of the sites together that you want to code, that, you know, you have to pick, you know, what is it that you're going to look at. So you need a space, you need somewhere where you can actually archive the sites, because, you know, you can sit, and I know Ross and Ben have done this in an election, and, you know, go through and code everything in a form, but then you can't get sick, you can't have a day off, nothing can happen. It's, you know, you're not going to have that many times when you're doing research that you're going to be able to devote 4 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever to actually sitting down and just simply doing that, unless you get a big grant and you get a team and you can get people to do it for you. So what you want to do is you really do need to think about archiving. And so we've used Archiving, which is it's a paid-for service. They do have sort of special rates for academics and educational institutions. But this is increasingly what people will do, is that they'll go to companies that have very big sort of server space, and then it's up to you to say what you want to put in there. So we bought enough space. There's 4 in my project that I'm doing at the moment. We have 4 elections, and what we're doing is creating a collection for each election of the sites that we think are relevant. So then you first face the idea of, well, what sites I'm actually interested in. Now, again, in the campaign context, it's answered a little bit in the sense that if you're interested in the official campaign, it's quite an easy ask, because what you want to do is capture all of their official sites, and then maybe if the leader has a special page, you want that also. blogs, if they run a blog, the leader does, or prominent ministers. Also, if they've got an official YouTube channel, Facebook profiles, an archive will capture all of this, right? So they will keep videos. Again, it's an issue of space and size, so you can't capture everything. But the good part is that something like Twitter, for instance, if you capture it on one day, it will have an art, as long as you manage to not just capture the front page, but you've captured more of the tweets. You can go back and you can capture it on one day, but you maybe have 15 days worth of tweets, because that's how far back you managed to set the crawler to capture it. So, so that's one side of the puzzle, if you like, is just actually your data collection or your data. Once you've got it, what do you want to do with it, or where do you want to go with it? I'm just making sure that I've got the right one here. So this is an example. This is looking at environmental organisations that was done quite early, actually, in a journal called Internet Research. And this is an example of kind of one sort of way of approaching this content capture and analysis. And this is a sort of, as I said, it's on one end of the spectrum because it's actually it's fully automated. So the idea is that you as a coder, you've got your sites, you've captured them, you've put them in your archive, and then you set to work basically a computer program which will go in and look at the sites and capture different aspects of the content, but in an automated way. So it will tell you how many documents are in there. It will give you the number of file types and what kind of extensions they have. And it will give you the number of forms, documents, etc., that allowing it to kind of process forms and feedback. And then navigation, does it have frames, does it have internal links? So the point is that what these guys did was that they took sort of code or part of a web page and then they interpreted it in terms of different kinds of content and different kinds of functions. And it's just to show you that this is possible. This hasn't really been done in political campaigns, as far as I can tell. But the idea is that you then move to, this is just what they've then converted that into, right? So they've got a spreadsheet where they've put various kind of aspects or items within the source code. So an anchor count, a form count, frames, right? So they've converted all that into, and they'll have done that for each single organisation in their database. And the advantage of this is clearly that you've got a large N. You can really do quite a lot of analysis. Of course, the disadvantage is it's entirely quantitative, and you're not really doing the nuanced kind of analysis, perhaps, of understanding maybe in a bit more depth what is on the site and what's there. And as I said, I haven't seen this done, and I do think this is an area, and I'll come back to this at the end, where I think we could be expanding in terms of our political campaigns. But you do need, as I said, that kind of computer knowledge as well, that computing knowledge. So you need to, as a social scientist, you need to find somebody who's done computer science and hook up with them. So what we've got generally used in this area is a kind of mixed method, and this is probably most of the work that I've done, which is where you do kind of manual coding and data collection. You develop quantitative measures for analysis, but your gathering of the data and the analysis of the data is not automated. It's largely done manually. And I would argue that there's probably been 3 stages or approaches that have been adapted or developed to kind of cope or apply this this method. So one is kind of to the early days of web, when really it was just static fixed home pages. You can almost argue they were quite flat, quite two-dimensional. And different approaches have been developed, which I'll go into, to sort of try and capture what the sites were doing and how they were doing it. There's basically sort of been 2 kind of approaches that have been used, mostly fitting into this kind of small n approach, which have kind of used indices and imposed, if you like, a kind of functional structure and then looked for content that supports that. After Web 1, we've moved to kind of sort of Web 2, or, the parties and campaigns have tried to kind of adapt to Web 2. But I use this kind of 1.5, actually this is not my phrase, it was Lilliker and Jackson, who were 2 academics who studied political campaigns online. And the idea there is that, well, there's an updating of the Web 1 schemes to try and incorporate Web 2. Whether or not it's successful, I mean, I'll let you be the judge of that. It's difficult, basically. It's a hard area to try and study. And then finally, there's this kind of new move by parties to develop these action centres. And this is really the change or the shift, is where they're actually using, almost the online environment is not the primary focus of the website. It sounds an odd thing to say, but actually what they're trying to do is stimulate action offline. And that's actually, again, another challenge for this area. It's like you're not just facing kind of a fixed content, but that's actually trying to promote activity. And how do you capture that? So this is sort of my kind of run through, if you like, of attempts to try and do this. Now, I can't see this, but this is, as I was saying, this large end approach, whereby this is a sort of hypothetical example. So it wasn't actually, it hasn't actually been used, as far as I can tell, to a very great extent on political campaigns. But it's saying that, you know, if what we wanted to do was look at websites, so we're not using the Bauer and Schall kind of automated method. We're doing a kind of, sort of qualitative analysis of sites. I mean qualitative in the sense of a manual, sort of more human coder driven, but turning it into quantitative measures. Then what would we do? Well, the idea is that we've got this kind of sort of way that we've divided websites into downward information flows, upward information flows, some kind of lateral or horizontal information flows, and then some kind of interactive information flow. And then the idea is that you look and you say, well, on the site, what can we fit in into the downward information flow? So typically, a party will put up things like its documents, like its manifesto. It might have election information. It will have biographies of the leader and some of the prominent sort of candidates. And then also, you know, they'll have things like frequently asked questions. So there's just basically putting information out there, and you could code that, right? So you can come up and you can say, well, okay, if we want to look at media releases, how many did they make available? If we're going to put something up about leader profile, how extensive is that? And you can start capturing these elements in a quantitative way, and basically, if you like, filling in the spreadsheet with variables that you will label under these titles or labels. And you can compare, so you could do it for a number of parties. Again, so you can look at sort of, do they promote upward information flow? So here it's like, do they allow people to donate? And you can have options of, they've actually got they can just simply download a form where they can send money off, or do they actually offer people the ability to kind of do something online to give money? So the idea is that you're looking at the site and you're saying, to what extent does it sort of promote upward information flow? And here you've got the lateral. So this is about links, basically. This is about how far it links out. So does it have links out to other parties? Does it make links to reference organisations or kind of educational links? And does it have internal links to other local parties and candidates? And then finally you've got this kind of interactive sort of flow, which can be asynchronous, meaning that, you know, you send some information off and then it comes back to you at a later point. So email is a good example of that. And you could code that and you could say, well, how many email addresses are offered? And then in addition, you've got this more interactive information flow, which is synchronous. So this is when it's in real time. So this is something like, do they have a chat room? And I guess you could go into a little bit more kind of detail than just a binary measure of, is it present or is it absent? You might say, well, how often is it being used? How many people are using it? And you might even want to do some sort of analysis of number of posts, that kind of thing. So this is just a kind of way of sort of saying that this is not imposing, if you like, any function on the site other than to say which way the information is flowing. But you can imagine that if you did this for, say, 30 parties or 40 parties or something, you did a comparative study, you could do some kind of sort of latent variable analysis where you just take these variables and you say, well, do they form clusters of functionality? Are the kind of information items clustering together to form some kind of information provision function? Is there an interactivity variable? And you could sort of do some analysis where you're actually looking at the site to kind of tell you what it's doing, rather than necessarily imposing it on it. Oftentimes, however, we don't have that kind of, because this is a labour-intensive method, right? Because this is manual coding, the idea of having this very large N, it is possible, and I have seen some studies which have used sort of, tried to sort of put in, if you like, a coding scheme on a number of different countries during EU elections, for instance. So it's not to say it's impossible. But generally speaking, what's happened is you're normally dealing with one country, one election, and a set of national parties. So what you generally tend to find are these kind of indices where the researchers have decided already that there is a function which is information provision, or there is a resource generation aspect. And you then map features onto it, right? So here you've got information provision, it's an additive index, it's just saying, do they have a documents file, do they have newsletters, do they have a people, who's who, do they have a leader profile, do they have candidate profiles? Yes, 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 they get 13 points. Resource generation, similarly, it's kind of cumulative index, and you could say, well, you know, do they allow people to donate through downloading a form and posting? Can they make an online inquiry? Is there a specific email, if you like, where they can actually ask about donating? Or can you make an online transaction and they get more points the more online it is and the more easy it is to do? Similarly, you can look at it networking, so you can say, okay, well, we can impose that on it and say networking is being performed if they have a lot of links to their own candidates, local parties, they have links to a lot of other parties and actors or references. They're engaging in participation, you know, if they've got some kind of email contacts, and also you can argue that there's an aspect of feedback. So how much are they promoting feedback? Do they have an email address on the site? Do they actually have a specific form where they say, we want your feedback? You get more points if that's the case. And then an interaction index. So do they have opportunities for online debate in the chat room? So you can sort of see how this is working. You're rewarding parties that are doing more of kind of online interactivity. But you're kind of, as I said, you're deciding in advance that this is what these things mean and coding them. And it's interesting, I'm just going to show you what we did was in the UK general election just gone. So we applied a kind of Web 1 index to most of the parties. I'll show you the results for 6 of them. So what we've got here is a kind of very basic sort of, and almost sort of standard kind of sort of version now about what you'd look for if you're measuring Web 1. So you're looking at information provision, basic information provision about the party. Then you're looking at campaign-specific information. Then you're looking at whether or not they sought to kind of generate resources. And then was there some kind of feedback or interaction? That's not to say Web 1 everybody thinks it's static and there was no interaction. I mean, it wasn't extensive, but there were sort of facilities that people could use to interact. So we applied this kind of as different as you can see. We've got indices and quite simple. You know, the higher score meant they were doing more of the function. And this just shows you some of the results for the British, 6 of the British parties. So this is the National Party size. This is Conservative, Labour, Lib Dems, BNP, UKIP and Greens. And kind of what's interesting is that, you know, it's probably not that surprising that, to be honest, most of them are doing most things, right? So most of them are, Conservatives surprisingly didn't have very much information. This is on the national level. Basic information, but most of them are providing some kind of campaign information. A lot of them, on some of them are doing some resource generation. There's differences in terms of the feedback though, and that's always been the case, I think. And it is interesting that the Liberal Democrats, the BNP, and the Greens, all of the kind of smaller parties, if you like, were doing more in feedback and interaction, which kind of fits with earlier work in this area as well. So that's not changed that much. So that's just to show you kind of some of the results, if you like, that you get from applying these methods. Okay, so Web 1 to Web 2 or Web 1.5. So as things moved on, we got into the late sort of 1990s, 2000s. You know, the Web 1 era coding schemes, they worked well for a while, but as I said, what they were good at was capturing this kind of relatively flat, sort of two-dimensional content where flows where information were largely downward or kind of upward, there wasn't very much interaction, and it was sort of lateral. Web 2 is clearly more problematic, and it's just because there's much more sites, right? So there's more things that the parties are doing. So capturing all of the presence that they have is a challenge, not just simply one website anymore. So they just stayed really safe, you know, it made my life so much easier. Then the whole thing is they've just become much more interactive, right? So the Web 2 social media, that's the whole point of it. It's about interaction. It's not just simply about slapping up information. So the consequences that the content will change daily, I mean hourly. So again, it's that question of how do you capture that? How do you measure that? You know, previously content, media, newspapers, television was quite fixed. You know, you had a news program, it went out on a certain time, 6 o'clock news, you knew what people saw, and it didn't change. Whereas here, you know, there's certain aspects of, you know, like blogs, for instance, you know, if a politician is blogging or they're using Twitter, that's changing all the time. Yesterday I was doing a workshop down in Parliament, and we were in Portcullis House, which is where the MPs have their offices, and I had to be interrupted by the bell, you know, that rings to tell the MPs that but it was quite fortunate because it was at both times my speakers were going on a bit too long, so it seemed like I'd always planned it to sort of say, and now they sort of had to finish because of the bell. So what's happened? Oh, and the other part I think is that, and this is sort of, websites in the Web 2 era have also become, if you like, more three-dimensional. So there's a kind of interoperability, right? So there's a sort of element, there's a depth to it. So it's not just simply about putting up a site, but it's about how that site links to Twitter, links to Facebook, links to YouTube, links to your blog. and there's a sort of interactivity within, it's not just one simple flat space. And also those spaces are designed to promote offline action. So as I said, this kind of, I'm trying to sort of capture that through the idea that's moving towards a more three-dimensional kind of understanding of the web and the web presence of parties. Again, how do you try and measure and capture that? So what we've come to is what Lilliker and Jackson sort of called, for at least what the parties' efforts, they say Web 1.5, is a sort of halfway house. It's a kind of hybrid. So web schemes are trying to incorporate more interactivity and these kind of features. But I think, and I'll show you some examples, but the focus is still very much on individual websites rather than the kind of Web 2 presence. So they still tend to go to the main party site and then sort of look at that only, and then use that as an example of how parties are campaigning with Web 2. They tend to be run as well as a kind of one-off in the campaign. So it's still this question. What happens is that people will do a survey, close maybe a week out from the election, and register all these different sort of features on sites that may be Web 2 oriented, but it doesn't actually capture the usage. It doesn't actually tell you much about how they're being used and how frequently they're being used, and really what the content is. I mean, in that sense, it's more just do they have a presence, and that's sort of it. And I think that the focus has been still very much on kind of online forms of interactivity, rather than, I said, this kind of new thing which social media seems to be introducing, which is online to offline. And interestingly, the work that's been done is still basically using this kind of adapted or hybrid sort of Web 1.5 approach, have largely concluded still that normalization, meaning that the big parties dominate, is still the case, and that parties are still, what the main conclusion seems to be, you see, they're just not interactive. They're I think that Lilliker and Jackson called monologic, right? Top-down, non-participatory. And arguably that's not necessarily the case. It's just that you need to, if you just simply look at the websites and look at different kinds of whether or not it has a blog or not, how does that really tell you whether or not they're participatory or not? And I think, so I'll show you some examples of, this is Lilliker and Jackson from a 2010 piece. So this is where they've really tried to go in and they've said, okay, Web 1, been and done. What we need to do is try and measure parties' use of Web 2. So this was in the general election, I think, of 2010. And what they've got is basically just a kind of binary measure of what the sites, the individual party sites had. And so you'll see that they've got what was present in the Web 1 days to a degree, but what they've tried to do is incorporate Web 2 elements. So they've got things like if they've got a weblog, if they use Twitter, if they've got a social network link from the site, if they allow visitors to share information, if they allow visitors to update information, a level of kind of interactivity, use of RSS. So there's this kind of sense in which what they're trying to do is capture this sort of three-dimensional use and this interactivity. But largely, certainly this research was based on party sites and candidate sites, their official homepage, and they didn't actually go out and look at how Twitter was being used or how the blogs were being used. And from this, they sort of concluded a picture of a sort of normalization and monologic discussion. This is just an example from Galati and Williams did a study of the US in House races in 2006. And so what they've got is a mobilization index, which again is this kind of desire to move Web 1.0 onwards. So they've got items about, do they have some kind of ability, an online volunteer form where they're trying to get people to sign up to help the party? Do they have materials that people can download? Is there an event form where they can basically fill out either online or offline, which allows them to run an event for the candidate? Can they use the site to tell a friend about the candidate? Can they use the site to send a letter to an editor? Right? So it's this idea of online to offline and mobilizing people to use, not necessarily social media, but that's the idea, is it's kind of this network sort of element that it's bringing in. This is Laura Stein, who did a study of social movements, the use of the web. And you can see again that she's got this kind of action and mobilization index. And so what she's got is to what extent the site was being used to try to coordinate online actions or plan international actions, plan local actions, coordinate offline actions. So she also has an interaction dialogue sort of index where she looks at whether or not they have a weblog on the site. Do they have some kind of member or supporter profiles that people can enter and be updated? Do they have participatory forums? So the point is that this kind of looking a little bit like the Web 1.1 era. It's just kind of trying to incorporate more interactivity. What we did in the general election of 2010 was did a very simple kind of index of Web 2 or Web 1.5, so in the original one you saw that there was this kind of information provision and kind of downward approach mixed with some aspects of campaigning and some elements of feedback and some aspects of networking. And so here we were kind of trying to capture the more sort of, if you like, this three-dimensional idea. So it's interoperability. So the idea that were they linking out to, did they have presence in these other spaces? And how many did they have? And then were they using their main sort of sites as a tool to recruit volunteers? Could people register as supporters? Could they share, forward, embed information? Write a letter to the editor, download apps. So this is mobilization element. So this is kind of interoperability, and this is kind of mobilization. And what we found, so this is just looking at the same parties using those same indices, just to give you the results. And you can see actually that in some ways they're not that dissimilar. It's not as if there's a huge divide between the major parties and the minor parties on the Web 2 front. So they were actually, according to these measures, none of them were maxing it out and doing extensive amounts. But there wasn't a huge sort of necessarily too much distinction. But this is, again, I mean, the index is quite limited and quite small, so it doesn't really capture sort of 0 to 20. It's only on a 0 to 6 scale. But from this, at least, it doesn't seem that there were huge kind of divides that were emerging. This is sort of trying to move us on a bit, right? So this is saying, okay, so this is sort of what's been done till now. But we need to think about how we might capture this content and this kind of usage as well. It's not simply the presence and binary kind of absence, not absence, presence of different things. So this is kind of a bid to sort of say, well, if we were going to analyse their use of social media platform, what are some of the variables? What are some of the actual content and uses that we would actually want to try and capture? So in Twitter, typically, you want to look at how many followers have been signed up, and you can see that. So we captured it on the kind of early days of the campaign and then right before the election. It's quite interesting that, you know, actually the Conservatives came out. I don't know at the local level if this is necessarily true. You probably like fill me in on that at the end of the talk. But at the national level, at least, the Conservatives clearly were the most followed. But they weren't the most. They didn't tweet the most, right? So the Liberal Democrats were actually tweeting more. This is their party Twitter site, right? So this is the official site of the party, not Nick Clegg. So this is. Well, Nick Clegg would have probably tweeted on the site, but this is the party site. I think this would have been around the time of the debate, actually. This one here, this huge spike, I think that's probably explained by the debate. But you can see it sort of fell off a bit of a cliff towards the end, and they weren't doing very much. Interestingly, both Labour and Liberal Democrats both kind of declined in their use of Twitter. For the Greens, BNP slightly, and Conservatives had actually kind of sort of increased. But so this is sort of getting at, you know, what would be some of, if we were going to try and capture Twitter and use of Twitter, what would be some of the data we'd want to actually look at? This is just for Facebook. So this is taking the parties and saying, okay, if we were going to capture information from Facebook, what might we want to get? So in a similar way to Twitter, you can capture likes, right? So how many people have liked that particular site? And you can see that the Conservatives and the Democrats were liked equally. More so than Labour and the other parties. This was done towards the end of the campaign. And then this is then going a little bit deeper and saying, okay, well, how active were they using Facebook? So what were the frequency of posts? If we take one day in the past 24 hours, how frequently did they post? What was the total number of comments? So did they allow comments, and how many comments were made? And what were the number of average comments per post? So this gives you some idea of the interactivity. I mean, the point being that when we did this, we captured this data and archived it. And so, as I said, this points out to the difficulties, if you like, of this kind of media and the fact that it changes every day. You'd like to be able to capture everything that happened during the course of the campaign, but you can't because you only have limited space. So you could go out and update this every day at the course of the campaign. We didn't, but you could argue that, we got sort of distorted results because we did it on this particular day, and we'd have to go back and look and see what was happening. So ideally, you'd want to run it over a long period of time, average it out, and say, well, what was, the typical number of posts in a given day by the Conservatives, by Labour, by the Greens. and how interactive were they. And then this is finally YouTube. So this is data that, again, typically you might sort of think about gathering if you were going to look at a YouTube campaign. So you'd want to look at, how many views, how many people actually came and viewed the channel, how many individuals had actually subscribed to it. So it's quite different. So the first is some more casual use. The second is actually people are committed to finding out what's on the channel. Then do they allow comments, and how many comments are being made, how many videos are being posted. So this is sort of just to give you, I guess, an idea of if you were going to try and sort of do a kind of content analysis of a campaign in the social media era, you'd want to look at the main site, but you'd also want to look at their use of these other kinds of social media and the kinds of data. What kind of data would you typically want to gather? And these kind of data, as I said, you can get from looking at the site as a whole. There are other technologies, like I mentioned at the beginning, Tube Mobile, which are software that you can download, and you can run analyses which will then give you updates every day on. It's automated. It effectively automates your analysis of YouTube and gives you and you can search it for videos on a particular topic, and it will keep them for you, and then go back every day and tell you how many views have been given to you. And so there are techniques that you can use where you don't have to do it all manually. This is just to say that, since the sort of Web 1.5, the parties have not been content to just stay with, so they do Web 1, yes, and they do Web 2, or Web 1.5, but they've also sort of now moved into doing these kind of web action centers. And this is sort of, I think, by their desire to kind of adapt to the Web 2 environment. So what they've done is they've sort of almost developed their own Web 2 sites, right? So they use Facebook and they use Twitter, but then they're now trying to build sort of social network sites that are party-based and offer the facility to have a blog, to have an email address, to have a group, to join a group or start a group, have an event. That you don't have to use Facebook for, you can use the party site. But they require registration, so they can't be archived. So this is a problem that you have to actually go in at this point, at least during the campaign, and look at them then, because you can't be sure that they'll still be live afterwards. The content changes, not just daily, but hourly. The focus is on, as I said, providing kind of offline kinds of online to offline activity. And I think, as I said, if you look at these kind of sites, it's interesting that you do get a slightly different picture than the Lilliker and Jackson, perhaps, that they concluded that the major parties were dominant, and I think this research shows that the major parties are better at creating these sites, but that actually this idea that they're monologic and they're just downwards, top downwards, is challenged, I think, by this data, because actually it's not, these sites are really not about giving information, they're about getting people to go out and do activities and interact with voters. And I'll get, so this is basically where it all came from, was the Obama site, the My Barack Obama, where, this allowed you to sign up here, and then you could register with an email address, and then you could get access to data banks and network your friends and get everybody excited for voting for Obama. MembersNet was Labour Party's version in 2010, so they'd been around for a while, only open to members, but then in the pre-election period it was opened out to everybody who registered and provided an email, so you could start sort of working for the party effectively even though you weren't a member. Lib Dems had their own as well, it's called ACT. The Conservatives had one too, and I had a still of it and I can't find it. And now when you go back it says, oh, we're under construction or under development. So the site is, if anybody's got a still of my Conservatives, then you can let me know, because I need one. I need one for next week, and I can't find it. So I think these sites basically have a number of different functions, and as I said, they're all about action, really. They're not really about sort of information provision. They're about building communities, getting these little networks going so you can have a profile and you can email your friends on the network. You can generate resources for the party. So the idea is you get a tool to go out and raise some money for the party, put a widget on your site that will then lead you to the Conservatives' homepage to donate money to them. Also giving you tools to go out and mobilise your friends. So in the last election, Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems, I think, all had iPhone applications. Put on your phone. You could then use your phone to then contact your friends and family and send them a message, basically, which said, go out and vote for X, Y, and Z. Don't forget to vote. So there's a kind of way in which they're using them to go out to get people to get out the vote on the part of the parties. And also sort of a little bit like crowdsourcing, so message production. So trying to get ideas from interested supporters and activists about what kinds of things they should put in their manifesto, or how they should think about their policies if they get elected, and certainly message distribution. So using people to go out and spread the word through email. You know, you could get an email where you could say forward it to 5 of your friends, and it would tell them something about the party and about their policy, and you could change it as well. You couldn't, it wasn't necessarily that you only could send a fixed message, you could adapt it and personalize it. So this is just a way of kind of, again, adapting some of those coding schemes to think about how we might measure these different functions. So basically taking items from the site and awarding sort of points if they've got all of them, or some of them, and coming up with scores. And I did this for the British parties, and so it's quite interesting that, again, those scores you saw from Web 1 and Web 2, the same parties being replicated here using this kind of action centre approach. And you can see that actually Labour did come out as being the most active in terms of using this type of sort of citizen-oriented or citizen-driven campaigning. Lib Dems second. The Tories were lagged behind, although they were really quite, they pushed more on this aspect of get out the vote. So the external mobilisation efforts on their side were quite extensive, but they just didn't bother very much with the community element. Or the other bits, and the small parties really were quite limited, and they didn't really use it very much at all. So, okay, so what does all this mean in terms of where we're going to go from here? So I think, as I said, coming back to the point that I made at the beginning, I think that perhaps or thinking through this automated kind of site data collection analysis is possibly one way forward. It allows that kind of comparative analysis, which we haven't really done much of in terms of most of the studies, as I said, have been kind of studies of an election in a country, looking at the party system at the national level. And you need to think about ways that we could expand these kind of methods to be able to do some more comparative analysis and create a large N of parties. And you can really start to then perhaps look and sort of try, do some statistical analysis of dependent variables and actually work out what's maybe, what's actually driving parties to embrace interactivity versus simply information provision. And I think that perhaps thinking through how we might use the Barrow and Shaw kind of automated approach is one way of doing that. I think just in general, the area really needs standardized measures because, as I showed you, we've got a number of different coding schemes that are out there. And I mean, it's sort of take your pick. It's sort of, there's not one standard, industry standard that we yet sort of apply, although people do tend to kind of sort of converge around a kind of, do they send information out downward or do they allow for interactivity? And those two sort of elements seem to be kind of featuring in most kind of coding schemes. But then within that, the kind of items that you pick, bit of a sort of random sort of selection. Archiving, I think, as I said, that's one of the big challenges in this area, and one for which I don't really have the answer, but because of the fact that sites are changing, that social media, there's no longer kind of just a fixed content on a given day. We know that X, newspaper put these particular stories out into the public domain. Now, the number of sites and the way that they change means that archiving and keeping a record of that is very difficult, and so that makes content analysis really hard. I think one of the other things as well is this kind of use of mobile applications. So again, that's going to be another challenge to sort of try and capture, the kind of, because content will increasingly be made for kind of mobile use, and again, that will change quite a lot. And how do we kind of try and think about how we might capture that? And then again, it's this online to offline. There's more of that. So these web will increasingly be used, at least in the kind of political context, I think, to try and sort of get people to do offline activities. And how do you kind of capture that interface? It's hard. And I think, as I said, I think what we're going to see probably more, and what I hope to see more, is the standardization of some tools, particularly to capture kind of social media. So what we need to see is kind of more acceptance. And this is, again, coming back to next week's training sessions and the workshop. This is what we're trying to sort of put on the table, is to say that there are various tools out there which are being used to try and capture Twitter and YouTube and Facebook data, but there's no kind of necessarily agreed standard. And what we need to kind of start moving towards are methods which gain acceptance in the social science community. And so you don't have to, when you write an article, go through, put an appendix that's kind of as long as your original article, to sort of explain what you've done and the method that you've used. And so that, but this is kind of, I suppose, early-ish days.